Are you ready to explore strange new worlds? Let's find out how with the brand new Star Trek Adventures 2nd Edition, tonight on the Old Dragoon. As this is being recorded, it's Star Trek Day, the anniversary of the airing of the first episode of the original series. And let me tell you, I grew up with Star Trek, and I am probably the last generation block of people that remember Star Trek before you had to specify which Star Trek series you were talking about. Star Trek The Next Generation didn't premiere until I was in junior high. So growing up, Star Trek was Star Trek. And boy, howdy, was I into it. I loved everything about Trek from a very young age. There's pictures of me as a toddler in a Mr. Spock Underoos shirt. One of my first toys that I have a recollection of is the Enterprise toy that came out with Star Trek the Motion Picture that you could take apart and put back together into different kinds of starship. Star Trek has been in my blood my entire life. And so when I first got into role-playing games, one of the first games I asked for from my grandparents was the FASA Star Trek role-playing game, and that started pretty much a lifelong propensity for running Trek games. I really enjoy Star Trek. And there was a time when I thought that nothing would ever top the original FASA rules. There have been several Star Trek games since then, and we'll probably cover them all eventually, especially Prime Directive, which is a completely different take on Star Trek. But then Star Trek Adventures came along, and I just fell in love with it. When they announced a 2nd edition, I was a little skeptical. Why? Because the 1st edition wasn't all that old, and there really wasn't a lot wrong with it. Well, except the trade dress on the interior of the book. So, in an attempt to make it look as Star Trek as possible, the book was laid out like an LCARS screen. For those of you who have watched Star Trek from Next Generation forward, that is the Library Computer Access and Retrieval System. Those nice black panels with the multicolored buttons that are basically touchscreens. Very forward thinking in '87. But as a readable book, white text on black background just made my eyes hurt. When they released the Tricorder box set, which, by the way, is brilliant and still eminently playable, I adored the little rule book that was black text on white background. And the fact that it all fit into a tricorder-shaped box with a strap. So, 2nd edition. I am happy to report that they have done this book in a much more readable fashion. And we're going to take a look through it. And then we're going to do something we haven't done on the channel before. We're going to create a character. So let's take a probably faster than our customary gander at Star Trek Adventures 2nd Edition. One of the first things you'll notice as opposed to the 1st edition is that we now have people in the Discovery uniform and people in the Strange New Worlds uniform. So this update did allow them to work in some background and some artwork from the more recent series that weren't in the Star Trek Adventures core book. I also love seeing someone wearing the Wrath of Khan Monster Maroons on the cover. That is my all-time favorite Starfleet uniform, even if I do not fit the one I got in high school. But we are up to date here. And you'll notice there is someone standing behind that Deep Space Nine Voyager uniformed science officer who seems to be in civilian clothes. That's because this version supports creating civilians straight out of the box. So, on the interior cover, we get a map. Focused on the Alpha Quadrant because that's where all our player character races are going to be from. I love that this particular interpretation of the map brings back the area where the Romulan Empire, the Klingon Empire, and the Federation all converge. In the FOSSA Star Trek game, this area was called the Triangle, and it was a whole lot of fun to play in. The Triangle was sort of a lawless, pirate-ridden zone where pretty much anything could happen. And it made a great place to run Starfleet intelligence adventures. It made a great place to run merchant marine adventures. It was just cool, and I'm glad it's back. Here are all the credits. And here is our table of contents. See that the first couple of chapters are really a crash course in Star Trek. Chapter 1 is a Star Trek primer, including breaking down the eras in which you can play. Chapter 2 is mostly about Starfleet. It explains exactly how Starfleet works, what it is and what it isn't, and how members of Starfleet are trained. Chapter 3 covers all sorts of elements of space travel, including weird phenomenon, space amoebas and other dangers, time travel, and the ever-popular alternate universes. I mean, who doesn't like a good Mirror Universe episode? I still contend that In a Mirror Darkly, from the final season of Enterprise, is one of the finest episodes of Star Trek ever made. Changed my mind. All right, so in Chapter 4, we start with character creation, and there's a couple of options for this. You can create the character using a life path, which is something I really love to do. Or you can actually choose creation in play and define your character as the first game session goes on, which is a neat idea. The game has neat mechanics for supporting characters. You can create supporting characters at certain points during the game using your ship's crew resource. Those supporting characters can fill in needed positions on a given mission. Say you need a geologist or a 20th century historian, but no one's playing one. So you can create one of those characters. Or say you're playing a Next Generation era game and the first officer refuses to let the captain beam down to the planet. The captain's player can create a supporting character and beam down with the landing party, and thereby play when they would normally be left out of the action on the ship. And this goes for any other player who's playing a character that wouldn't logically be chosen for an away team. These supporting characters can go into a pool so they can be brought back, much like Chief O'Brien in early Next Generation, and they can eventually grow into main characters of their own. Chapter 5 explains living on starships. Chapter 6 explains all of the fun doodads, gadgets, pads, tricorders, and other gear that are available to you in the universe. Chapter 7 gives you an idea of how the game system works. Chapter 8 covers combat. Chapter 9 is for game masters. There's an introductory adventure in 10, and then you've got your necessary bestiary and compendium of aliens in Chapter 11. So as you can see, this is a lot more readable than the old white text on black Star Trek Adventures First Edition. So as I said, we're going to go through this a little bit faster than we did the other books so that we have time to make a character. There are some iconic characters like Commodore Nella Zen here who give some sidebars on things in universe and things having to do with the game and explaining the game to you as we go. The good old what is role-playing. And then here is where Star Trek Adventures explains how it plays a little differently from Dungeons and Dragons or many other role-playing games. I love the artwork on the bottom of this page. That art of Kirk and Spock and Scotty in the background is very reminiscent of the cover of the FOSSA Trek box set, second edition. And this picture just kind of gives me the nostalgias. So what you need to play, you will need D20s, and only D20s. Star Trek Adventures First Edition had these effect dice. They were D6s that were specially marked with a Starfleet logo, a 1 and a 2, and a couple of blank sides. The effect dice were used to measure effect of things that happen. How much damage does the phaser do? The effect dice have been eliminated from this version of the 2D20 system. I am assuming it's very close to the Dune system, which does not use the effect dice and didn't from the get-go. Achtung Cthulhu still uses the effect dice. So, we move along. The game covers writing supplies. It covers covering your safety in session 0. This is something that's new to gaming, and some people get really upset over why do we need safety rules for role-playing? But I realize that we've been doing this all along and just haven't given it a formal name. My groups have always had a person or multiple people who have a subject they just don't want to talk about. And obvious things would be rape, torture, things like that. You don't have to get explicit with those things when they happen, or allow them to happen at all in the particular story you're telling. And that's always been the way I've played. I just didn't have an official name for it. It's just like Session 0. I didn't know the term Session 0, but very, very often over the last 30 years, we sat down to plan out our the feel and the tone of a campaign before we actually made characters. I've always felt it's important for the players to understand the game master's intent, and for the game master to express that intent to the players to make sure that they're going to be comfortable in the kind of game the GM wants to run. Everybody kind of has to be on board. Nowadays, it's called Session 0, but back then we just did it. Starfleet people in formation. Almost nothing makes my black little heart beat faster than seeing Starfleet acting in a professional, I'm not going to use the M word, fashion. Formations, when they actually have headgear in the reboots and in Enterprise, you know, all of the things that those of us who spent any time in a uniform got really used to and don't see too often in Star Trek. So the core mechanic is explained here. It's called the 2D20 system because in most cases you're going to start building a dice pool with 2 20-sided dice. You're going to take your attribute, which is generally in the neighborhood of between 7 and 12. You're going to add what would be called a skill in any other system, but it's a little broader than that. We'll get to that in a minute. You will add that, which is 0 to 5, 5 being the absolute pinnacle of skill, together. That will give you a target number. You're going to roll the d20s, and you're looking to roll under. Each d20 that scores equal to or less than that total scores a success. Natural ones score 2 successes. And then there's focuses, which we'll talk about in a moment, that increase your ability to get the additional successes. But for the most part, every time you're asked to make a test, you are going to toss 2d20. But that does change, and we'll explain that as we go on. Strange New Worlds art. All right, we're going to kind of zip through the Star Trek primer. Most of you out there are familiar with Star Trek. And if you're not, well, this exists in the book, and hopefully you'll pick up a copy and want to play it. The Star Trek universe has been ongoing and growing since 1966. There is a lot of room to adventure. There's a lot of canon, but don't worry about that. You can always be in an alternate reality or play in a time period that hasn't really been covered. There is a whole ripe era between the end of Star Trek VI and arguably the first 15 minutes of Star Trek Generations, and the beginning of Star Trek The Next Generation. We don't know a whole lot about what went on during that large chunk of time. We do know Captain Picard had his first command, the Stargazer. We do know that Captain Rachel Garrett commanded the Enterprise C during this time, and Enterprise C went down fighting Romulans over the Klingon colony of Narendra 3. But there are large swaths that are left unexplored. The Cardassian War. I nearly forgot the Cardassian War. And so did Star Trek The Next Generation for the first couple seasons. Apparently the war had just ended, and nobody mentioned it until the Cardassians show up in The Wounded, which is a great episode, by the way. The minstrel boy to the war is gone. Anyway, so this entire bit covers everything about Star Trek. And it does cover some of the things that can be a pretty sticky subject to talk about. Religion in Star Trek, for instance. Money in Star Trek. And whether or not people still use it. I actually like the compromise that they came up with here. It works. There is a form of currency. It is not money, strictly speaking. And all of your basic needs are covered by the Federation if you're a Federation citizen. But any work you do can provide you with extra resources to go above and beyond the basic standard of living. So if you want to buy a bottle of Chateau Picard, or go eat at Cisco's restaurant in New Orleans, you can do that. So here is where they talk about Starfleet. Again, for those of you who may not be as familiar with Star Trek, most of the shows have focused on people who are in Starfleet. Starfleet is sort of the research navy of the Federation. Now, they spend a lot of time saying they are not the military, but they do have uniforms and ranks and carry sidearms, and their ships are armed. And anyway, what it boils down to is they're not the military in the way we think of it now in the 21st century. They do have a defense mission, and they are the armed fleet of the Federation, but they are not entirely specifically there for tactical functions. It's kind of like if you took research ships from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and armed them. Every now and then, Starfleet builds a pure warship, but it's not too common. All right, so we start getting the discussions of Starfleet, and I love the little breakdown of Starfleet during the various eras, because there is a very different feel to the different eras of Star Trek. The original series, which also includes the time period of Strange New Worlds and the early seasons of Discovery, was very much like the Age of Sail, in that the captain of a starship does not have immediate access to their superiors. And so when a novel situation is encountered, the captain has to make the call. They can't just radio home for instructions. That could take days or weeks. So the captain is very much the plenipotentiary of the Federation. As you go forward in the timeline, communications and ship speeds increase to the point that the method of determining faster than light travel is redefined between the generations, so that Warp 3 in Star Trek The Next Generation is much, much faster than Warp 3 during the original series. So things move faster. You can often radio home much more often and more instantaneously. And so the feel changes a bit. Also, by the time of Next Generation, they have invented a device called the replicator. And that is pretty much what it says on the tin. The replicator can take raw matter and reconstitute it into almost any other kind of raw matter. Now, there are some things that for story reasons the replicator can't do. It can't create a living creature. It can create meat so that you can eat your steak without actually killing an animal. It can't create some elemental compounds. There are vaccines that it can't create. That comes up in an early episode. You shall have no vaccine and no Lieutenant Yar. Also, there are certain elements that can't be replicated so that they become used as currency by other species. Latinum, for example. The Ferengi and many other species use latinum as a form of exchange simply because it cannot be replicated. Someone with a replicator could create all the gold they want, but they couldn't create latinum. Rewind back to the original series, and one of the classic episodes, Devil in the Dark, had Captain Kirk and his crew helping a group of miners, and they do talk in that episode about how the miners are going to be ridiculously wealthy once they resolve the issue that's happening in the episode, because the planet they're on is super rich in gems and precious metals. So during that time period, there's still a lot of trade. In fact, they do mention currency a couple of times. You know, Scotty, you've earned your pay for the week. Or Star Trek VI, where Scotty says, well, retirement suits me. I just bought a boat. You can go all the way up. Well, you can go anywhere you want. But if you're following the shows, you can go all the way up to the 32nd century, which was depicted in the final seasons of Star Trek Discovery. The far, far future, after an event called the Burn, pretty much took faster than light travel offline for a long time. So the Federation is clawing its way back to being a solvent nation. And Starfleet is once more in the position of going out there and being, in many cases, the sole representatives of the Federation. It's actually kind of neat and got me back into Discovery when I had sort of started to drift on my interest. But it's a different setting. The Federation is very small, and resources are pretty rare. So that can be fun to play. I really don't like the detached nacelles, though. All right, moving forward. So we talk about all the different things in Starfleet and how Starfleet Academy works. Missions and quarters and duty assignments, types of missions, away teams. I kind of rankle at this a little bit. In original series Star Trek, they were called landing parties. And much like the fact that La'an in Strange New Worlds now seems to operate the weapons on the Enterprise, concepts from Next Generation and later have started to filter their way backwards now that we're making prequels. And so the term away team has now been retroactively applied in the past. Again, the same thing with tactical officers also being the ship's security officer. That was not the case in old school Star Trek, but it seems to have propagated backward. So the different kind of missions that can be done, ideas for playing non-Starfleet games. There is an entire core book for the first edition for playing Klingons. And this picture is kind of cool. The ship's cook is an important job on Klingon vessels. And in the role-playing game, you can grant bonuses to your crew by preparing a particularly excellent meal before they go into action. Here's where we go over all of the things that you'll find traveling in space. Class M or Minshara class worlds. Those are the ones we can breathe on and live in without doing anything special. talk about different life forms, different space phenomenon, and boy, was the early Star Trek big on strange space phenomenon. They explain how warp drive works, why dilithium is valuable, how subspace radio works. There's some discussion of the mirror universe and other universes that may exist. This mention of the Cerritos does remind me. The animated series, Lower Decks, that was also not part of the original core book. They got a source book later, and now they're included in this new second edition core book. I have to admit, I was a tiny bit skeptical when I found out there was going to be a comedy Star Trek animated series, but good Lord, it's funny. A couple of my friends have declared it just too frenetic. They can't keep up with the pace and didn't like it. But my family absolutely fell in love with it. And while my 2 teenage kids have not gotten bitten by the Star Trek bug, they will sit down and watch Lower Decks and laugh at it. Time travel. In case you want to go back and meet Edith Keeler. I love that the shuttlecraft from Strange New Worlds, actually a lot of things from Strange New Worlds, are so respectful of the original design aesthetics. That's one of the things that turned me off to Discovery in the beginning, is that nothing looked particularly Star Trek. Strange New Worlds has gone out of its way to be respectful of the design language of the original Star Trek and just update it. So we're going to talk about how character creation works. You have attributes which are not the ones you're thinking. So in Dungeons and Dragons, we have things like strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Most of those are pretty straightforward. I think the only 2 that I ever really have to explain to new players is, why is wisdom different from intelligence, and what exactly does charisma mean? Here in Star Trek Adventures, your attributes are a little different. Your first attribute is control. You can see here by the text, this is about controlling yourself, but also precision and accuracy, careful timing. Anytime an activity requires something like that, the GM will probably tell you to use control as the basis of your target number. Daring is exactly what it says on the tin. How do you take action in a particularly brave and decisive way? Fitness encompasses strength, dexterity, and constitution, to use Dungeons and Dragons terms. Anything that is looking at your athleticism or your general conditioning of your body will go for fitness. Insight is your ability to read other people, maybe get a look at body language or mood or things like that. Also, your own self-awareness. Presence is sort of charisma from D&D. It is your ability to project your personality. You know, can you command a room when you walk in? Are you the kind of person that a crew will follow no matter what, simply because you have that special something? That's presence. And then reason is, of course, straight up logic and book learning knowledge. Then you get your departments. Now, this is the really neat thing. Rather than having an exhaustive list of skills and sub-skills like, Star Trek from FOSSA did, the whole bottom 2/3 of the character sheet are 3 or 4 columns of individual skills that are broken down into very, very granular things like small equipment systems operation, small equipment systems technology. Computer operation and computer technology are 2 different skills. Using a transporter and repairing a transporter, 2 different skills. Here, Basically, there are 6 skills, which are referred to as departments because they cover everything that particular department would do on a starship. 2 for each color of shirt. In Star Trek, the uniforms tend to have color codes that give you a vague idea of what the person wearing the uniform does for a job. In original series, the red uniforms belonged to ship services, security, engineering. The blue uniforms belonged to science and medical personnel. And the gold uniforms belonged to command personnel and positions like helm officer, which tended to be in the chain of command. Sulu was left in command of the Enterprise several times. During the Next Generation, the red and gold colors flip-flopped. The real-world reason is that Patrick Stewart didn't screen test very well in gold, so they changed his uniform color to red and flip-flopped the colors. Now, sometimes this gets a little confusing. In Discovery, looking at people's department requires you to take a really close look at the badge they're wearing. The uniforms really don't make determining that easy. In Enterprise, there are stripes on the shoulders, but the ones that are really confusing are the Monster Maroons, the uniforms from the Star Trek II period. And you could also throw in the pajamas from Star Trek the Motion Picture. They broke down the departments into more granular choices. And so there were more colors involved. And in some cases, some of them were a little hard to tell apart at a glance. But it's there. So you have 6 departments in the role-playing game. 2 for the red shirts. That would be engineering and security. Gold shirts if you're next gen. You have 2 for the gold shirts. Command and con. And this is not con as in conning somebody out of a sandwich. It's con as in Mr. Spock, you have the con. The ability to control a ship. And for the blue shirts, you have science and medical. Those are the 6 quote-unquote skills in Star Trek Adventures. That's it. They're rated from 0 to 5. Every Starfleet character will have at least a 1 in each department. Someone who's an experienced practitioner is going to have a 2 or a 3. 4 is really, really excellent. And 5 is people at the top of their game. This explains exactly what you can do with command, con, engineering, security, medicine, and science. You can mix and match combinations of attributes and departments in any way that makes sense to your character. A helmsman who is being very cautious might roll control plus con, but one who dives their ship in without regard to pre-planning and just flies by the seat of their pants might roll daring plus con. Stress replaces a hit point mechanic in Star Trek Adventures. Your character can be taken down by taking an amount of stress equal to their fitness attribute, give or take modifications from other things. Stress can be restored in a number of ways, including just straight up rest. Stress does not necessarily mean actual injury. In fact, it's the way to avoid injury. You can also think about it as your plot armor. Focuses are more like what we're used to in other role-playing games for skills. You can choose anything you want as long as the game master agrees to it to be a focus under a particular department. That allows you, when you are working within that focus's purview, to count any number on the D20 up to your department rank as a critical success. So if I have security of 4 and I roll a 4 or less, I count extra successes, rather than someone who doesn't have a security of 4 with a focus, or someone who has a security of for, but doesn't have a applicable focus. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, if I have a security of 4 and say martial arts. So on a 4 or less on a D20, I would score an extra success. The persons without a focus would need to roll a natural 1 to do that, even if their security is the same level as mine. Without the focus, no bonus criticals. There's a big page of sample focuses, which is great. It helps people kind of figure out what they'd like to do or gives them inspiration to make up their own. And then you have values. Values were the hardest thing for me to get used to because values are statements that represent your character's, well, values. It's sort of like an alignment, but much more specific. Looking at this page, there's some like, get them before they get you. That's not generally a very Starfleet value, but there it is. My crew is my family. I am surrounded by a team I trust. Values can come into play either by your character holding to their values, and certain bonuses will occur, or challenging their value. Challenging the value is interesting because it allows your character to kind of grow by realizing that something they held dear may not always be true. This is sort of like in Star Trek VI, when Spock admits to Valeris that sometimes the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many. It's not logical, but as he says, logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. Spock has evolved through his experience of dying and coming back to challenge his earlier values. So the values come in as sort of a alignment mechanic, but there's also mechanical benefits to using your values or challenging them. These are the hardest thing for me because coming up with something that's not like a platitude or something that's not going to be terribly generic is sometimes difficult. Life path. Those of you that were with me for the Traveler video know that I love life path systems. It really gives you a grip on where your character has been and what they've done. So the life path starts with you choosing a species. There are a lot of them in this book. Then you choose the environment you grew up in, and that gives you a value and will adjust your attributes a little bit. Then how you were brought up and whether you rebelled against that or went with it. For instance, you might have an artistic upbringing. Your parents were artists. Did you roll with that and become an artist yourself? Or did you rebel against it because you feel nothing could be more boring? Then you go into your career path. You go to Starfleet Academy. You choose which of the color shirts you're going to wear. And you move through the academy picking up department scores and bonuses, focuses, and value. Then you choose how experienced your character is. This is also fun. You can choose to be inexperienced, a brand new ensign, or a crewman straight out of enlisted training. You can choose to be experienced. So you're that lieutenant on the bridge who's been on a few missions. You know your way around. You're not brand new, but you're also not super senior. Or you can choose veteran and be one of those crusty old senior chiefs or commanders on the ship who have been around the block way too many times and have a lot of experience to impart to the other players. Now, in any case, you're still only going to get 2 career events. We'll get to that in a second. But you'll pick up a value and a talent based on experience. What are talents? Talents are like feats in Dungeons & Dragons 5e or any other version of D&D for the last 24 years. They are specific use things that are, while not unique, most people could like choose some of the same ones and have a lot of redundancy, but they set your character apart. They help you define what your character is good at. And you'll pick up one of those here. Sometimes that talent is hard coded. For instance, the inexperienced character is given a specific talent, and the veteran is given a specific talent, while the while the middle, the experienced character, they get to choose a talent. All right, then we go into career events. Now, your character may have served in the fleet for 2 months or 20 years. You're still only going to roll or determine 2 career events. These are sort of the standout moments in your character's life. Those will also add to your overall statistics and doodads for the character. And then finally, you'll do finishing touches, where you can add a couple of points and a talent and make up a pastime for your character and basically just round them out. Character creation is a lot of fun, and it also, taking you through these steps, gives you a real idea of where your character came from and how they got where they are. So here's a quick rundown of the species that are available. Andorian, Enar, Bajoran, Betazoid, Cardassian, Denobulan, Ferengi, Human, Klingon, Orion, Romulan, Tellarite, Trill, Vulcan. And that's the end of the list for this book. But that's quite a few options. Also, if we go back to human real quick, note that the human trait, the species ability that humans get right underneath the boots of this piece of artwork, Faith of the Heart. I love that. So we're going to buzz through all of these different options because we'll pick one and look at it closely while we make a character. The experience levels: novice, experienced, and veteran. The things that can happen to your character in their career events, how to do the finishing touches, examples of pastimes, your role on the ship, and other things you can do with your life if you're not Starfleet. Here's a list of Starfleet ranks and where they fit in. I love that enlisted is included here. Let you play characters like Senior Chief O'Brien. And then all your fun gear. Here's the place that tells you how to create your character during play. I have never used this, but it's kind of an interesting idea. And it sort of reminds me of the first season of any television show, really, or any Star Trek series. The characters are kind of roughed in the pilot, and you slowly get to know them more as the show goes on. Here's explanations of those rules I was telling you about for supporting characters and how to create them. Big list of the talents that are available. This is like your feats chapter. How your character will advance. Advancement in this game is nowhere near as dramatic as it is in games like Dungeons and Dragons. But it does exist, and it does happen. It's just a little more slow and a little more nuanced. Reputation is a mechanic in this game. Your character starts out with no reputation or low reputation and works their way up. Oh, that's right. In this edition, it's 3. My bad. Reputation can work both ways. It can either be a positive thing or it can dispose people against you if your reputation is something that they wouldn't agree with. Say you're a great peacemaker with a huge reputation in being an ambassador who preaches peace. The Klingons are probably not going to respect you too much. Lists of awards. I always love stuff like this. Reprimands for when you do something bad. Come on. Every Star Trek series has got to have a court-martial episode. And then we talk about life on a starship. Starships have systems much like player characters have attributes. And then starships have departments in the same way characters do, but that represents that ship's focus toward having people of that job aboard and facilities for them to use. Ships have shields, which work a lot like character stress. And ships will take damage once the shields are down, much like characters will take injuries once their stress has gone away. The ship can assist the players. And the neat thing about this game is not all ships of the same class are going to be identical. You choose a space frame for your ship, and then you choose how that ship is outfitted for the mission. And that will make the ship different than other ships of its class. Here's the NX class. I really love this ship, especially the version that we didn't get to see. They have made models of it, though, and that is the refit of NX-01 that has a secondary hull. It starts to look a little more like the standard Constitution class layout we're used to. There's the Strange New Worlds version of the Connie. And lots more ships from all the eras of Star Trek. Some threat ships, or these could be your PC ships if you're playing a different nationality. And then the mission profiles that you can choose for your ships. For instance, you could outfit your ship for espionage and intelligence and basically do Cold War submarine missions in Starfleet. Or you could outfit your ship as a multi-role explorer, which is a very evenly balanced role. Or scientific and survey operations. A whole lot of focus toward research, not so much towards being able to defend itself. This is probably why the Grissom blew up after being hit by a single Klingon torpedo. Ships also have the equivalent of talents and traits. Oh, refits. For every 10 years of a ship's service life, you get to give the ship a refit. This means that ships that have been in service forever, say a Constellation class ship in Next Generation, the ship is probably 70 years old. Why is it still flying around out there? Well, because they periodically bring her in for service life extension programs. There's your ship feats, the list of ship talents, rules for how starship weapons work, rules for shuttles and other small craft, all the gear that your characters can use, and then an explanation of the rules and how they work. We can't really get into the nitty-grit because I see we are already at 50 minutes. But the basics are that scenes are a thing. They are a game mechanic. When a scene happens, it has several effects. For instance, you have a resource called momentum that we'll discuss in a moment. Every time you change scenes, the momentum pool degrades by a point because you are no longer moving forward in the situation you were a moment ago, we have now changed scenes. So time may have passed, or we may be in a different location. So you have 1 point less momentum. This is to encourage you to use it rather than hoard it. The scene may have traits, and those are things that you can react with mechanically in the game. Discovering traits is something that players can do, or characters can do, through certain die rolls and through intuition. Treknobabble, yay. Tasks are what they call a die roll. So normally, you start with the 2d20. However, you can add more dice to this, either from your talents or by spending momentum. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. Or giving the game master threat, which we will also talk about in a moment. Difficulties are how many successes you need to actually succeed at the task. The higher the number, the more difficult. And that's where you'll want to grab some more dice. That's where you'll want to have an ally aid you. This mentions difficulty 0 tasks. Why would I want to roll the dice for that? Because additional successes above and beyond what you need add to the momentum pool. And sometimes it's useful just to generate some momentum. Different kinds of tasks, flowchart for how to carry one out. Complications are what happens when you roll a natural 20, or in some other situations, the complication range can be larger. And then there's the idea of success at cost. This is a very modern role-playing mechanic to my eyes. Because in the old days, if you failed, you failed. But over the years, game designers have noticed that that's no fun. For instance, there's a great discussion about secret doors in Dungeons & Dragons and why, if they exist, your players should always find them. Those of us that are old school and grew up on early versions of D&D like myself will go, wait a minute. Finding secret doors is an inherent ability of certain characters, thieves, elves, dwarves. If we take that away from them, then that's something within their shtick that they can't do. But the counter argument is, if they all fail their roll and the secret door is never found, then whatever's behind that door may as well not exist. And if it's vital to the continuing narrative of the adventure, then your characters are stuck. Success at cost allows you to fail forward. You pick up a complication. And the game master decides how you succeed in a minimalistic way. So momentum. Momentum is a shared resource. It's a single pool that the entire group uses. You can spend momentum at any time, and sometimes you can spend momentum multiple times on a single task. These will be called repeatable spends. For instance, if you are making a roll to analyze something, you succeed at the roll, the game master gives you some information, but you have some momentum in your pool, so you decide to spend momentum to get more information. But you want even more information than that, so spend another momentum and gain more information. It's neat. Momentum also gives you the ability to roll additional dice when you're making a task roll. You can only have up to 6 points of momentum in your pool at a time, and each additional die costs a little more. So 1 point for a single die. The next die is 2 more points, and the die after that is 3 more points. So you can empty a full momentum pool, adding 3 dice to a task. I've been reading a lot of other games here and there, so terminology's getting mixed up in my brain. Here's some explanations of what you can do with momentum. Notice keep the initiative on there. This game does not have initiative rules in the traditional sense. The players, almost always, unless the game master has a specific situation in mind, like an ambush, the players will almost always be able to have one character act before anyone else does. Then the initiative passes to the game master characters. Spending momentum allows you to keep the initiative and activate another player character. So there's a lot of things you can do with momentum, which is pretty cool. Oh, I want to mention very quickly the create a trait momentum spend. Remember when I said traits could be mechanical to a scene? Imagine you're on a planet. A bunch of Jem'Hadar have just landed and are coming for you. Your security officer can spend, or anyone, but your security officer in this case, can spend some momentum to create a trait. 2 momentum points and say, look, over here, I found an abandoned trench. And you take cover in the trench. So the players do have a bit of narrative ability in this system, as long as the game master agrees and the momentum is there. Determination is sort of your, like inspiration points in D&D 5e. You can only ever have 3. You start the game with 1, and determination tends to come when you are behaving according to your values. When you spend determination, one of these effects occurs. You can reroll your d20s. You can set one of the d20s to a 1 automatically. Or you can use a talent you don't have. Threat is the dark mirror of momentum. The game master has a pool of threat. The game master uses the threat to manipulate what's going on in the game to make things more difficult for the players. The players can do things that generate threat, but benefit them through action. So you're increasing the level of danger in order to succeed at something. Like if you don't have any momentum in the pool, but you want to roll extra dice, you can do that. But instead of spending momentum, you give a like amount of threat to the game master, which the game master can turn around and spend. I will say this. Having played Conan 2D20, Achtung Cthulhu, and Star Trek Adventures, to an older school DM, or even someone starting out, threat might feel a little adversarial. I always try to be an even-handed game master. I'm not out to kill my characters. A TPK is not a goal of mine. So, spending threat to specifically harm my players or make things more difficult to them just felt punitive. But I learned really quickly that if I don't do it, the game is too easy. If the players are allowing their momentum to flow and I'm not using threat, they're going to burn right through any narrative things I throw at them. Technobabble generation tables. Some rules for cranking up the detail and the stress. Extended tasks, which are things that take longer than a single die roll to get done, like, say, fixing the warp drive. The rules for combat are here. They are largely taking the task system and applying it to combat. Social conflict is a thing, and it is covered in the rules, so you can use your character's abilities on the character sheet as well as your personality to make social combat happen. The combat system is medium crunch, I would say. It's not Phoenix Command, but it's also not super simple. The thing that you're going to have to remember is all of the possible momentum spends, possible threat spends, the keywords on each attack. Certain weapons have certain keywords. Even your fists might have certain keywords. And what those keywords mean. That was probably the most difficult thing of learning the first edition of Star Trek Adventures. This one is a little simpler in that they take out that extra step of rolling the effect dice, but there are still keywords that you have to kind of know. The Game Master screen certainly helps with this. Starship combat has been simplified a little bit from the previous edition. Each person that has a bridge station will be responsible for their own little corner of the ship's operations in Starship combat. It's kind of neat. I love that they've given us flowcharts for everything. And examples. Here's the GMing section explaining how this game works, what threat is, how to set task difficulties. It's a pretty good Game Master section. And I feel like I grokked this much more quickly than when I was looking at first edition Star Trek Adventures. They're very, very, very similar. This game kind of smooths out the lumps of the first edition, and that is much appreciated. The introductory adventure. We're going to speed through that because we don't want to give that one away. How to play NPCs, adversaries, and some sample people. Starships. And your fun alien creatures like the Moopsie. If you haven't seen that episode of Strange New Worlds, or as you were, of Lower Decks, go out and watch it. Here's the character sheet. When I took my first look at it, I wasn't quite sure. But now that I've created several characters, I dig. Here's the log so you can keep track of what your character has done. And the book has a great index. The timeline in the back can help you decide where to place your campaign. There are much more detailed timelines online, but being able to flip to the back of the book and take a quick gander, very useful. And there's the back cover. So, we've looked at the rules. Let's make a character. Alrighty then. This is the website at sta.bcholmes.org for creating Star Trek Adventures characters. Now, when you bring this up on a modern monitor, it's going to look much smaller and much tighter. I have zoomed in so that it's at least somewhat intelligible on the video, assuming you're watching it on a actual monitor and not on a phone or some other device. This character creator is free. It has recently been updated to the 2nd edition. And it has several functions besides just making characters. You can make starships with this. You can look up talents. You can create tokens for your virtual tabletop, and I will show you that because it's really cool. So let's make a character. We're going to click Characters and Starships. It gives you a list of all the sources so you can click which source books you own. I have clicked Core 2E, which is 2nd edition Core, and the GM's Toolkit 2E, which throws some extra stuff in. I own a lot of these other books, but because we're making a 2nd edition character, I'm not going to activate any of them. Standard RPG rules is what we just read. The solo RPG, using the Captain's Log rules. That's something that we may look at in another video. Captain's Log is a recently published solo version of Star Trek Adventures, so that you can play it by yourself. But we're looking at the standard rules. Which era do we want to play in? I am really digging Strange New Worlds these days, so I'm going to choose Original Series. Our options here to make a main character, a supporting character, a ship, or randomize some stuff. We're going to make a main character because that's what your PC will play. We are a Starfleet character. Let's see what random species gives us, just for funsies. We rolled Andorian. Let's go with that. So as an Andorian, we get a description of the Andorian species. We get our initial attributes set. So the other attributes will start at 7. These 3 have been improved to 8 because we chose Andorian. Here's the Andorian species ability. Now in 1st edition, you were given a choice of species talents and you had to choose one. In this new version, there's a species ability you just get, and there may or may not be other species talents according to your species. The Andorian trait. So I'm not sure if we covered traits. Traits are pieces of information that may or may not affect things or can act as on-off switches. For instance, if there is a poison that only affects humans, it is not going to affect characters without the human trait. There are traits in scenes, which we did discuss. Could be dark room, could be reactor failure. Those are both from the 1st edition examples. But here you can add additional traits, and you'll see that here in a little bit. But Andorian is added to our character because we have chosen the Andorian species. So now we get to pick the environment we grew up in. We're going to randomize that too. Our Andorian grew up on an isolated colony. So we get an explanation of, hey, you're from a place where there's not a lot of people. You get to pick an attribute. Let's go with Insight. And you get to bump one of your departments up. Let's see. It's an isolated colony. So maybe this character needed to learn a little bit about first aid. Here's where you create a value that has something to do with the environment you grew up in. Let's see what the random gives us just for fun. We are all connected despite being worlds apart. Well, that kind of works for somebody that grew up in an isolated colony. So let's keep it. Your early outlook. Let's see how we were brought up. Random. Science and technology. We'll take it. Science and technology. So our home was filled with the potential of science, etc. and so on. Do we accept or rebel? It would be kind of stereotypical for an Andorian to reject science. So let's go ahead and take it. We get a +2 on our control, +1 to reason, and we get to choose some departments. So this character is starting to look a little sciencey. So let's go ahead and bump science up. And then we get to choose a focus that has something to do with our scientific studies. See what it gives us. Subspace communications. Hey, that's interesting. Now we get to pick a talent, and here's the part that will go on and on and on. There's a lot of talents, and if you add some of the extra books, there's even more talents. I am not quite sure which talents still apply because the rules have changed a little bit between first and second edition, but there's a lot of them here. Let's see if we can find something. All right, we are bold with science. So whenever we attempt a science task and we buy d20s by adding to threat. So this is where we're going, here GM, have the ability to make things more difficult. I want some extra dice. You can re-roll a single d20. So this encourages your character to take risks and toss threat to the GM. So the character now goes into Starfleet Academy. We have already said we're kind of lean toward the science track. So let's go ahead and pick that one. We can bump some things up. For science, we're going to want some reason. Probably going to want some insight. And this character has already gotten a talent that shows that they're a little reckless sometimes. So we'll bump up daring. The primary discipline will be science. And the secondary discipline will be, sure, medicine. Now we get to pick 3 focuses. Trauma surgery, microbiology, and geology. Interesting. So this is going to be sort of a cross-trained character who is both a scientist and a doctor. Random value, never leave a stone unturned. Hey, that sounds good. Now we've just unlocked this talent because we have a science of 3 or better. So once per scene, when you attempt a task that relates to information you received from an obtain information question, the first bonus die you purchase is free. That sounds good. Let's do that. Oh, we get another secondary discipline. That was my bad. All right. So medicine, let's bump up engineering. Career length. Let's go random just to see what happens. Novice. So we got a brand new Starfleet Academy graduate. Let's get a new value. Push me too far and you'll see my ugly side. Okay. Talent, untapped potential. This one is given to you automatically anytime you make a novice character. It means you can't have a department above 4. You're too young and inexperienced. You can't have an attribute above 11. And you can generate bonus momentum or threat. Choose one attribute to use with this talent. Let's double down on daring. Now we get 2 career events. We're going to do these randomly too. First contact. So we were involved in a first contact mission. We get a point of presence. We get to bump something up. Let's go ahead and take a little bit in security. Focus cultural studies. That makes sense. Our second career event is a breakthrough or invention. Hey, that's great for a science-oriented character. We'll go ahead and bump reason up one more time. Engineering just went up automatically, and we get another focus, invention. How appropriate. Now for finishing touches. We get to bump 2 attributes up. Let's go ahead and get fitness because it's still at the default 7. And you know what? I'm going to put another point in daring to bring it up to a 10. So it's even with our control and our reason. We get to select 2 disciplines to raise. We can't go above 4 in any discipline. So we could get our engineering and medicine up to 4. We could bump our security up to 3, or we could get some talent in command and con. I think we'll bump engineering. And point in command. We get another value. Diplomacy is the first and last solution to anything. Yeah, that works for this character. And then we get to pick yet another talent. This is the part where most players will get the analysis paralysis. I'm talking to you, Jessica. And you know what? I'm going to take combat medic. This Andorian doesn't seem very interested in warfare. So perhaps, much like Hemmer, this Andorian is something of a conscientious objector. So great with science, great with medicine, great with engineering, and trained to help people out in an emergency. Maybe some EMT side training. Finish. So now we get to give the character a name. And in the book, just like here in the character generator, there are some suggestions for names. I think I'm going to make this a female Andorian simply because Hemmer was a male Andorian and Shran was a male Andorian. So the characters we saw a lot of tended to be male. Plus, when we did see Shran's mate, she was pretty cool. So let's look at the names. Talus was her name. Yeah. I like Vissia. Let's borrow Vissia. And then pronouns, as opposed to just having a place for sex, they put this in there because there are so many races like Binars, which do appear in the system. They haven't been updated to 2nd edition yet, but they don't have a traditional gender. And then there was that race that Riker romanced in that one episode. Plus, if you've read some of the old Star Trek novels from the 80s, you might want to be a Horta. So we're going to put she, her in here. And for rank, we'll go with ensign. Additional traits. This is where you can just add things because you feel like it. I'm going to put conscientious objector in here because it's an interesting idea. For pastimes, let's say she picked up playing Domjot in the academy. Her assignment is going to be a science officer. And the last ship I played with was USS Hathor. We'll keep that. A name I picked out of FASA Star Trek. You can make up any job you want if you choose other down here, which is cool. And then they show you all your values so that you can edit them if for some reason you've changed your mind. Let's view the character. Ensign Vissia, Andorian Ensign. So we can scroll down and see all our stats. I'm going to zoom out in the browser so you can see what this would kind of look like normally. There's 100%. So I know you guys can't read it, but you can at least see the layout. You can also click Export to PDF, choose one of the character sheets available, and create a PDF of the character. You can print that out and play. So that's how you create a character for Star Trek Adventures. So what did you think of our overview of Star Trek Adventures 2nd Edition? What did you think of the character creation process? Do you like walking through character generation when we take a deep dive into a game? Let me know. And throw in some things like what era of Star Trek would you want to play? All right. In our next video, we'll be getting back to Dungeons and Dragons. We're covering the original wood grain box era. In the last D&D video, we covered the box itself. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the expansions that came out for that box. That will give us a full view of what original D&D looked like before the first major revision, which was the Holmes Basic set. So tune in for that one. This has been the Old Dragoon, and remember, character is what you are in the dark.